Begin. Good afternoon, buongiorno, buenas tardes. I want to welcome everyone to our symposium on Michael Parenti's memoir, Waiting for Yesterday, Pages from a Street Kid's Life, which is sponsored by the Vito Marcantonio Forum. My name is Gil Fagiani, and I will be your chairperson. First, I'm going to ask that everyone turn off their cell phones and other electronic devices, please. I want to begin by thanking two members of the library staff for helping us make arrangements for today's event, Jennifer Kraft, and our usual contact person, Sherry Macklin. She's not here today, though. The Vito Marcantonio Forum is an historical, cultural, and educational organization that brings together people from a wide variety of backgrounds interested in disseminating and sharing knowledge of the life and work of Vito Marcantonio. A protege of Fiorello LaGuardia, Marcantonio was the most electorally successful radical American politician of the 20th century. He served as a congressman from East Harlem for 14 years, 1934 to 1936, and 1938 to 1950. Critical to his success was his unique multi-ethnic coalition of Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. And I believe today's presentation marks our 18th, something around our 18th public event since we reconstituted ourselves on October 11, 2011. So I'm going to give a little summary of some of the things we've done in the past to give you a flavor. Our activities have included a celebration of the fourth printing of Professor Gerald Meyer's book, Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, which we did on October 27th in 2011 at the Old Breck Forum. We consider that the best history of Marcantonio. There's several others, but I certainly believe it's the best. The naming of a conference room at Hostos Community College after Marcantonio at the behest of Professor Meyer in 2012. The special tribute, Vito Marcantonio and the Puerto Rican People, Solidarity and Progress, on November 28, 2012, attended by more than 100 people at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. The panel, Vito Marcantonio, 1902 to 1954, Spokesman for the Left, which was presented June 8, 2013 at the annual Left Forum held at Pace University. With the goal of ensuring the Vito Marcantonio Forum would become a fully integrated nonprofit organization, we held a fundraiser to celebrate our second anniversary at Gaetana's Cucina Italiana on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village in November of 2013. On February 22nd, 2014, here at the Mulberry Street Public Library, we presented a book party, dramatic readings, and discussion of The Heart is the Teacher by Leonard Cavello, who was a teacher, educational theorist, long-term East Harlem resident and activist, and one of the most important historical figures in the Italian-American community in the 20th century. On May 10, 2014, along with the Italian-American Writers Association, we sponsored a book lecture with slides of Simone Cinotto's fine work, The Italian-American Table, Food, Family, and Community in New York City. Again, that was here at the Mulberry Street Library. On August 9, 2014, on the 60th anniversary of Vito Marcantonio's death, 70 people gathered at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx to celebrate his life. To further honor his memory, Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz and New York City Council member and speaker Melissa Mark Viverito attended and sponsored a proclamation naming August 9th as Vito Marcantonio Day in the Bronx. They also promised to work with us to name a street after Vito Marcantonio. On October 19, 2014, at Gaetana's Cucina Italiana, the Forum and the Drama Workshop Project sponsored the Vito Marcantonio Forum, a theatrical reconstruction of Congressman Vito Marcantonio's radical legacy, dedicated to our late Vito Marcantonio Forum founding member, Morgan Powell, who unfortunately passed away last year. In celebration of Black History Month, the Vito Marcantonio sponsored a talk, East Harlem's African American Community, by Chris Bell, who's with us today, author of East Harlem Remembered, Oral Histories of Community and Diversity. And by the way, Chris has published 2 other books about East Harlem, so he's a leading expert on the neighborhood, Vito Marcantonio's neighborhood. Again, at the Mulberry Street Library on May 4th, 2015, in celebration of Labor History Month, we sponsored a presentation by Gerald Meyer on the American Labor Party with dramatizations by Roberto Ragone and Art Bernal. On Saturday, May 9, 2015, at the Cornelia Street Cafe, the Vito Marcantonio Forum and the Italian American Writers Association featured 2 Vito Marcantonio Forum founders, Stephen Siciliano, who's going to be presenting today, and yours truly. Stephen read from his novel manuscript, The Goodfather, that tells the life story of the radical congressman. And I read from my collection, A Blanquito en el Barrio. On September 19th, we celebrated Pope Francis's visit to East Harlem and Italian American Cultural Month with a People's Pilgrimage to East Harlem, starting at Lucky Corner at the northeast corner of 116th Street and Lexington Avenue. We started at 12 o'clock. The highlights of the walk included a visit to Vito Marcantonio's home and Our Lady Queen of Angels Elementary School, where the Pope did visit. This was a church that was shut down to parishioners' protests in 2007. So that was quite a I think a rather radical thing that the Pope did to even go there. And part of our pilgrim, one of our goals for the pilgrim would be that the Vatican would admit that they made an error in prohibiting Vito Marcantonio from being buried in a Catholic cemetery. And that's one of the reasons why we created this mass card. It looks like a mass card, but it celebrates the 60th anniversary of Vito's death. But we wanted to make it look like a mass card because of what Cardinal Spellman did. And finally, at this month, at Austin's Community College, we presented a talk by Professor Gerald Meyer and dramatizations by LuLu, Pascale, and Roberto Ragone on the theme Congressman Vito Marcantonio, Champion of Immigrant Rights. So today's program is going to be a symposium on Waiting for Yesterday, Pages from a Street Kid's Life, which is published by Bordighera Press, which is Michael Parenti's memoir of growing up in Italian Harlem. I think I'm going to start by reading Michael's biography. Michael Parenti received his PhD in political science from Yale University, and for many years taught political and social science at various institutions of higher learning. Eventually, he devoted himself full-time to writing, public speaking, and political activism. Parenti is the author of 23 books and many more articles. His highly acclaimed writings cover a wide range of subjects: U.S. politics, culture, ideology, political economy, imperialism, fascism, communism, democratic socialism, free market orthodoxies, conservative judicial activism, religion, ancient history, modern history, historiography, repression in academia, news and entertainment media, technology, environmentalism, sexism, racism, homophobia, Venezuela, the wars in Iraq and Yugoslavia, ethnicity, and his own life, his own early life. So you can see he's written about a very broad range of topics. So today's program, we're going to begin with Stephen Siciliano, who's come down from California. He'll be doing a book. He'll be doing presentation on Michael's book, and that will be followed by Roberto Ragone, who will be doing a dramatization titled 1940s Reflections on East Harlem Streets, and that'll be followed by LuLu LoLo doing some readings, chapters of Michael's book, and Michael will also do a brief reading as well as participate in the Q&A. So I'd like to remind people that we have some books today, both Michael's and my collection of narrative poetry that's set in East Harlem. And I also want to mention that we have several events that we're planning on in the future. One would be maybe a book presentation by Marcella Bencivani called Italian Immigrant Radical Culture, and the other is a book presentation on a book that I just read. I was very impressed by it, called War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson A. Dennis. So before we begin the program, we're going to do a little ritual that we do every time we had a Vito Marcantonio event, and that is that I'm going to read my poem, Litany of San Vito. And today, special treat, we have somebody from Italy who's going to read my Italian translation of it. So I'm going to first read it. And this is Ketty Romagnoli. Where are you from in Italy?
Bologna.
Bologna, okay. The Red City, Bologna. Okay. Litany of San Vito to Congressman Vito Marcantonio, 1901 to 1954.
Litania di San Vito, Congressman Vito Marcantonio, 1902-1954.
San Vito of East Harlem, pray for us.
San Vito di East Harlem, prega per noi.
San Vito, bread of the poor, pray for us.
San Vito, pane dei poveri, prega per noi.
San Vito, crucified by Wall Street, pray for us.
San Vito, crocifisso da Wall Street, prega per noi.
San Vito, martyr of McCarthyism, pray for us.
San Vito, martire del maccartismo, prega per noi.
From the jail cell walls, San Vito, deliver us.
Dalle pareti della prigione, San Vito, liberaci.
From the backyard crap game, San Vito, deliver us.
Dai giochi d'azzardo nei cortili, San Vito, liberaci.
From the loan shark's vig, San Vito, deliver us.
Dal pizzo dello strozzino, San Vito, liberaci.
From the drunken stupor, San Vito, deliver us.
Dall'ubriachezza molesta, San Vito, liberaci.
From TB and asthma, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla tubercolosi e asma, San Vito, proteggici.
From the social worker's visit, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla visita dell'assistente sociale, San Vito, proteggici.
From immigration raids, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla caccia agli immigrati, San Vito, proteggici.
From the landlord's greed, San Vito, protect us.
Dall'avarizia del padrone di casa, San Vito, proteggici.
Okay, so I'm gonna read our first participant's bio. Stephen Siciliano is a journalist with 30 years' experience. He's the author of 2 novels, Vedette, or Conversations with Flamenco Shadows, and The Sidewalk Smokers Club. He is the creator of the blog Marcantoniana, Items from the Life and Times of the Marvelous Vito Marcantonio. And I also want to mention that he's written a first draft manuscript, which I've read, on Marcantonio, which I think is going to be a very, very important work. Let's give a warm welcome to Stephen Siciliano.
Thanks. Thanks for coming. A little bird told me that Michael Parenti has written 25 books, not 23.
That's right. First person to ever get it right.
Dear readers, dear fellow readers, Waiting for Yesterday takes the worldview expounded upon in Michael Parenti's earlier works and applies it to a micro-world that he knows best. The result is not only an encapsulation of his childhood in East Harlem, It is a distillation of those ideas put into a story, the story of a neighborhood, and the neighborhood as character. It is a very efficient work, clocking in at a modest 155 pages of a street kid's life. The reader will find the character sketch of a gritty neighborhood tucked into the northeasterly corner of Manhattan, as well as renderings of Frog Eyes Martino, Clam, Banjo, Al Ross Rossellini, Randy Bowe, and a terrifying grade school teacher, Mrs. Meyer, whose, quote, thick freckled hands swung out at us without warning, sending heads ringing and eyes tearing. These person stories, as well as others, Parenti writes, are seasoned with commentary about broader social realities, including how the forces of culture, class, and ethnicity act upon our lives as we come of age. This is a coming-of-age story about how Michael Parenti became the Michael Parenti we know today. And this talk will focus on those three elements: culture, class, and ethnicity. As with all our remembrances, Parentis do not pass logically from one milestone to next personal landmark. Like all our memories, it's fragmented and characterized by things that struck him and impressed him during different phases or even small moments of his developing life journey. He writes of East Harlem, quote, "The backyards were a forest of clotheslines, poles, and fences. The cellars, with their rickety wooden steps and wrought iron banisters, opened directly onto the sidewalks. On warm days, the streets were a focus of lively activity, with people coming and going or lounging on stoops and chatting. Small groups of men engaged in animated conversations, while children played ball in the streets or raced about wildly. There was always something of interest going on in the streets, but rarely anything of special importance except life itself." He tells us it was not an urban village. Many people were unknown to each other, even on the same block. He adds, lamentably, from his perspective, that it was a heartless world that he saw from his grooming grounds on 118th Street. A bruising world some pages later, from which his dear mother took too early an exit. Hovering over us, he writes, was the Great Depression, a mysterious force that explained why there was never enough money and why my father was working all the time or looking for work. His elementary school, PS 85, Parenti declares in this memoir, as an institution of captivity, where real learning and creativity were squelched by condescension, overbearing discipline, and nationalistic propaganda. If you're familiar with Mr. Parenti's searing critique of our society, you get a sense of the distance in his intellectual journey as he describes his understanding of the American dream at that time. And he says, "It was my unexamined faith that the U.S. acted only with benevolent intent and beneficial effect, the shining light and hope of all mankind." The school itself promoted betterment, almost always defined, he says, in terms of material advancement, winning out against others on the job market, and rarely as dedication to the less fortunate, to social causes and mutual benefit through cooperative efforts. Textbooks at PS 85 featured, quote, American beauty mothers, children who chased butterflies through green meadows and said things like, "Good morning, Mr. Robin Redbreast," to birds in the trees. Writes Parenti, "The only experience we East Harlem kids had talking to birds was cursing at the flock of pigeons that occasionally circled above the rooftop to victimize us with their oddly well-timed collective incontinence." He was raised by two part-time Catholics who didn't attend Mass, confess, take Holy Communion, or believe in an afterlife. This lassitude became part of Parenti's own makeup, clearly. His choice for discussing religion in Chapter 6, entitled Priests and Politicos, gives one an immediate sense of where he stands on matters of the Catholic faith. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and he writes with both irony and glee. I'm going to share just one short one, which is his take on consuming the body of Christ. As a lapsed Catholic, I think they call that the Eucharist. Anyway, Holy Communion, holy cannibalism. He talks about his local public library as a socialist institution and said it was, quote, far more nourishing to my mind and spirit than the neighborhood church. Quote, the immigrant men drank wine made in their own cellars and smoked stogies. We nasty youngsters called the stogies guinea stinkers in reference to the old Italians who smoked them. And here he's engaging in the time-honored severing of old country ties by immigrant offspring, born modern, born American. It's one of numerous ambiguities, frictions, and ironies rolled into the story of Italian identity in the New World that this curious book takes on. He had an elementary teacher with a classicist appreciation of Italy, its art, its music. Her Italy, Parenti says, was a vast museum that bore no resemblance to the ragged southern locations from which most East Harlem families hailed. Quote, if Miss Rosenthal had said less about Donatello and more about DiMaggio, she would have done better at stirring our ethnic pride. He notes how those who were born in the old country and came to the U.S. between 1880 and 1920 did not, in fact, consider themselves Italians. It was a newly formed nation state, and not everyone in the southern part of the country was flattered with the association or thrilled with being part of it. But here, everybody was classified as Italians, and the second-generation kids among them, Mr. Parenti, came to view themselves in that way. They went to DeWitt Clinton, and there were Irish kids, African-American kids, Puerto Rican kids, Jewish kids, and Italian kids. So that when he asked his dad if so-and-so was a paisan, his father told him, no, he's Napolitan, meaning he was not Barese, like the Parenti clan. The earlier generations identified with their little country, il piccolo paese. Nonetheless, he notes that his grandfather, in the end, expanded his language comprehension of the standard Italian used in local papers like Il Progresso, until he became less Barese and something of an Italian himself. And here's the irony, and he says, quote, so the immigrants who came here did undergo an acculturation process of sorts. While the dominant society thought of training them into Americans, some provincials like Grandpa Parenti managed to turn themselves into Italians. I don't want to give them all to you, just make it clear that the author spends good time on the way shifting circumstances changed what the meaning of being Italian meant, not just here, but in Italy. And Waiting for Yesterday, he writes to reverse the general perception that there was something comically tragic about Italian soldiery, setting the record straight on their valiance in World War I and pointing out that there's more than one way to win a military conflict. While not forgiving Italy its unfortunate dalliance with fascism, Parenti observes that, quote, the ordinary recruits in the Italian army had no desire to get themselves killed in Il Duce's wars. Their readiness to surrender and unwillingness to give their all on behalf of Nazi and fascist conquest should be a point of pride rather than of derision. The immigrant Italian is largely responsible, he writes, for the city of New York as it is physically constituted, burrowing tunnels for the subway system, crawling along beams hundreds of feet in the air and picking up the garbage for decades. But after all this discussion of Italianità, the author reminds us that, quote, the claims made by all the various ethnic groups hold some truth. Un mondo, molte storie. One world, many histories. Together, over generations, they all built this country. The early Irish were said to be, quote, shiftless, conniving, unclean, clannish, sodden, and riotous. The same litany of unappetizing attributes tagged onto other groups such as Native Americans, blacks, Italians, Poles, Jews, Chinese, and Latinos, give or take a few adjectives. He says, one thing you can say about ethnic enmity, it's never in short supply. East Harlem was, in fact, a patchwork of provincial self-segregation, by which he means Neapolitans tended to live on one street, Sicilians on another, and the Genovese a few blocks away. Beyond this enclave of Southern Italians, there were significant concentrations of Puerto Ricans and African Americans, and they did not always get along. Feelings, quote, for example, between the Puerto Rican and Italian communities at the time were strained, as is often the case when low-income ethnic enclaves find themselves competing for housing, schools, and recreational areas. The Italians saw the Puerto Ricans as encroaching. The Puerto Ricans saw the Italians as shutting them out. For Parenti, it was more a matter of class than blood, and this full-fledged belief of his in the coexistence or the possibility of it between different groups, he represents something of Congressman Vito Marcantonio's legacy. And we are, after all, the Vito Marcantonio Forum. And what we're trying to do is make sure that the amnesia that affects his career is erased. So we would talk about him at this event of ours here. Everyone, Parenti points out, is a multi-ethnic confection. Gerald Meyer, the author of Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, has written about Marcantonio's efforts to diffuse tensions in the neighborhood after a rumble between African American and Italian students got picked up by the local press and blown up into something much worse than it was. The congressman convened community leaders for a powwow at the local high school auditorium, and Bobby Soxer-era Frank Sinatra to come talk to the students about living in peace together and croon for them too. Parenti remembers a racial incident from his own child when two African-American kids sort of got blown off course and walked through his neighborhood. Quote, he says, their goal was most likely to get beyond Lexington Avenue into the safer for them passages of Black Harlem, that menace who occupied the interior wilderness west of Lexington. These are the frontiers of urban life, which I find amusing. Suddenly 4 or 5 Italian kids surrounded these guys and started roughing them up, and he says the boys looked terrified. They were about to get seriously roughed up. From out of her basement came a poorly dressed, robust, high-spirited immigrant Italian woman whose name I did not know, but whom I had seen many times. Hers was one of the very poorest families on the block. Her kids were often seen sitting on the sidewalk, barefoot and dirty-faced. You leave those boys alone, she shouted in her Italian accent. They're more better than you. You hit them, I'm gonna hit you. The bullies were not prepared to deal with a furious, middle-aged neighborhood woman. They released the 2 intruders. He also talks about a conversation he has with an academic colleague, an African-American who is a professor like himself. This guy's African-American grandma was a farm woman from the impoverished South who had very little schooling and lived her later years in a northern urban working-class environment. My grandmother, Maria Parenti, was an impoverished peasant woman from southern Italy, illiterate, who lived her later years in a northern urban working-class environment. While toiling in the kitchen, my grandma would hum a little ballad filled with sing-song Italian sentimentalities. While toiling in the kitchen, the African-American woman improvised a gospel tune. At one point, his colleague turns to him and says, hey, are you sure we don't have the same grandmother? And Parenti says, in many instances, give or take some variations in language artifacts, menu and costume, the underlying script of the human comedy is very much the same. Too bad we cannot readily live with that awareness, finding reassurance in our similarities and enjoyment in our differences. Too bad. When it comes to a memoir of this type, we get a first-hand accounting of the final product as person, the ultimate brand to which the author is attached by his own designs and desires. In the congressional elections of 1946, some thugs beat up a Republican precinct captain by the name of Joseph Scotarigio, and Marcantonio's many and accumulating enemies in Congress set up a special committee to see if they could peg this thing on his organization, to destroy him with it. The special investigator spent a lot of time making associations between Marcantonio and certain rough characters in the district, all of whom he always defended. And one of these was a guy named Dominic Petrone. They alleged he was a Marcantonio bodyguard and had been picked up in the dragnet after Scotoriggio's murder.
Not Petroni. He never worked for Martin.
Let's see. Vito said Patron was not a bodyguard, rather one of his American Labor Party captains for a district that had only 100 votes and nearly 100 votes near Lexington and 3rd Avenue. Marcantonio defended this guy in a very heartfelt fashion before the committees. I know Dominic Patron. I know him well. And I am ready to stake everything that I am, everything that I have, and everything that I will ever be on the complete innocence of Dominic Patron. Time and events will prove that I am right. I make that statement because I know that boy. I know him well. He points out that Patron used his not insignificant earnings as a boxer to buy his mother a house. He was telling this guy's story, making sure he didn't get the schmo treatment. And waiting for yesterday, Parenti discusses another East Harlemite, Dominic Petroni, with an I. This Petroni was a boxer too, and he taught Parenti something of that violent art. Now, the journalist and empiricist in me would normally say, one's an E, Patron, and the other's an I, Petroni. Move on. They're not the same. But it turns out that the Parenti name was originally Parente, with an E. And for one reason or another became Parenti. Parenti's Petroni sounds a little less successful than Marcantonio's Petrone. But for me, it's hardly a stretch to suggest that they are not the same man. In Waiting for Yesterday, there is a recounting of a friend of Parenti's experience years later when he runs into a derelict on the street who, upon closer inspection, turns out to be Dominic Petroni. And I bring this up because if they are the same man, it says something about the power of an effective community leader and the devastating impact losing them in mid-career can have on those who both rely upon and support them. Parenti writes, Vito Marcantonio goes unnoticed in the official political history of this nation, but he was loved and mourned by hundreds of thousands. For some of us, he remains unmatched. Unmatched! And that is coming from someone who is decidedly political in his writings and his life's work. As for Dominic Petroni, he writes, he believed in the American dream. He tried the best way he knew with his fists to make the dream come true. His failure story is one of the many that never find their way into the mainstream press. And it is such stories, these forgotten, hidden, and purposely ignored tales, that I feel Parenti chose to focus his writing and political energies on low over these many years now. Which is to say, he is no gentleman historian. Gentlemen historians, he explains, in his assassination of Julius Caesar, have never thought well of the common people of history when they bothered to think about them at all. His argument is that history is largely written by such gentlemen who perceive reality in accordance with their high posting in the class structure, quote, uncomprehending of any social need beyond their own select circle. For centuries, he said, history was considered a patrician literary genre. And in short, historians have a class bias, and this, along with ethnicity, is the most prominent message in the book from my perspective. Quote, democracy, a wonderful invention by the people of history to defend themselves from the power of the wealthy, took tenuous root in ancient Rome. And again, in the assassination of Julius Caesar, which is really an education if you don't know much about the difference between the early and late republics in Rome, the gentleman historian Cicero considers the Democrat Catiline supporters as composed of debtors, gamblers, layabouts, parricides, assassins, debauchers, effeminate degenerates, and louche characters of every sort. This is what has come down to us over the years as the Roman mob. And it has served as a kind of template for degrading portraits of democratic forces down through the centuries, really. Agustin de Foja was a fascist writer in mid-century Spain. He wrote a novel called Madrid, From Royal Court to Checa, which recounts what happened when the Spanish capital fell under the rule of armed socialist and anarchist trade unions after the fascist coup had got the whole thing going. He's a fascist, but it's a good read. In the same way you root for a murderer escaped from prison to evade the rabid dogs and redneck correction officers chasing him through the swamp, you can have empathy for the terror-stricken bourgeois folk hunted in this revolutionary environment up to a point. In one passage, de Foggia describes a parade of radicalized masses. Quote, he writes, hordes in revolt filed by, ugly housekeepers, hunchbacked with red ribbons tied in their mops of hair, anemic and filthy children, gypsies, limpers, Negroes from cabarets, curly-haired, starving students. All the inferior and terrible world aroused by their sinister banners. And this is where de Foggia loses me and a lot of people, and I think this is where we see the difference between right and left around the world. To the leftists, this portrait is one of democracy in action. It's a sign that the lowest are germinating, beginning their first steps away from grinding oppression and toward a personal flowering. The person on the right, and de Foggia's language made clear, finds this mass to be something to be suppressed, silenced, and in the case of Spain, murdered, a disease to be eradicated. The business of the common people is not oft told in history books, and Parenti made it his job to tell the stories of Fra Guy Martino, Clam, Banjo, Al Ross Rossellini, Randy Bowe, Vito Marcantonio, and even Mrs. Meyer, who was a working woman. This is what he calls in Julius Caesar, writing history from the bottom up. And why would he want to do that? The answer brings me back to East Harlem and to my clothes. Waiting for yesterday, the author tells of the time when he and his mother were watching Gone with the Wind, when a scene where all the belles retire to nap for the afternoon while they are fanned into cool comfort by the slaves. He says, my mother and I found this scene distasteful. They sure are served hand and foot, she remarked disapprovingly of the fancy ladies. She was identifying with the slaves. So was I. It was a matter not of race, but class, although we never explicitly used the term. We identified with the slaves who toiled like draft animals and not with the plantation aristocrats who were so lavishly served. We were poor. There would never be anyone fanning us in hot weather. It's not about race. As Marcantonio taught, so saw Parenti and his mom, who their actual and natural allies were. Remember what and where the Parenti came from. Quote, the Mezzogiorno was impoverished because of centuries of exploitation by aristocratic rulers, Vatican landowners, and foreign occupation. The plunder from above created severe poverty and desperation below. The harshness suffered by those at the bottom had a distorting effect on their life chances and life attitudes. Survival became the prime preoccupation. East Harlem, naturally, or as a result, was inhabited mostly by hardworking and usually underpaid proletarians, more or less sane folks who were ordinary heroes of the landscape. Here, the working poor lived out their lives largely unsung and unnoticed. Michael Parenti sings that song and makes their arguments for them as well. His belief in the power of one class to repress another and its universal application is deep and wide. He sets out, for example, to demystify the purported treasuring of children in Italian immigrant families. He says, they sent their young ones to work at an early age and expropriated their earnings. For most of the immigrant adults, there was little possibility to face the world with ease and tenderness. Expropriated. This is the expression of a profound sense of the natural right one has to their own person and labor, even in childhood. Ease and tenderness. In a market-driven world, even these come at a price. Like Marcantonio, Parenti has worked to connect goings-on in the larger world with what was happening in the neighborhood, tying the global to the local. He notes years later, as the family moved out of East Harlem and siblings put deprivations and insecurities of the immigrant family behind them and mellowed with age and post-war prosperity and the advent of children and grandchildren of their own, they tended to get along much better with each other. It was a good example of how relations within the larger society influence personal relations. I'm closing here. Parenti himself has been both forceful and lucky in transcending his working class background, and he knows it. Quote, I'm greatly indebted to progressive individuals of generations before, whose names I do not even know, who fought for the principle of higher education, the idea that a worker's child can get a degree, and venture into reserves that are usually open to the offspring of affluent families. He gave back. For him, betterment was not defined in terms of material advancement, winning out against others on the job market. His values have been of peace and justice, fair play, environmental sustainability, for communal caring and power sharing. We know from Waiting for Yesterday that he was pounded by police at demonstrations, and that in 1974 he ran for Congress in Vermont on the Liberty Union party ticket, which may have been something like getting beaten up at a demonstration. From his Contrary Notions collection, we know his political writings and actions cost him an academic post at the University of Vermont and a position at Brooklyn College. An eternal angry young man born in 1933, he did not stop. Waiting for Yesterday is his chance to tell one common man's uncommon story and the stories of the common men and women around him. Before the gentlemen historians of tomorrow choose to forget both he and they. He has dedicated his life to this class he describes again in Julius Caesar. They who struggled against all odds, with all the fear and courage of ordinary human beings, whose names we shall never know, whose blood and tears we shall never see, whose cries of hope and pain we will never hear. To them we are linked by a past that is never dead nor ever really past. And so, when the best pages of history are finally written, it will not be by princes, presidents, prime ministers, pundits, nor even professors, but by the people themselves. For all their shortcomings, the people are all we have. Indeed, we are they. Thank you.
Okay, next on the program, I would like to read LuLu Lolo's Pascale's bio. She's a lifelong resident of East Harlem, a playwright, actor, and international performance artist. LuLu has written and performed 8 one-person plays off-Broadway and is currently researching the correspondence of Congressman Vito Marcantonio. LuLu was a Blade of Grass Fellow and a Lower Manhattan Cultural Council writer in residence. She's a board member of the Vito Marcantonio Forum, a member of the Triangle Fire Coalition, and the City Reliquary Museum in Brooklyn. Let's welcome LuLu Lolo.
I will be reading the last pages of Waiting for Yesterday. I selected these pages because it takes place in Little Italy, and it deals with a subject that concerns me as a lifelong East Harlem New Yorker. Mr. Parenti, I know the house you grew up on 118th Street. It was around the corner from Charletta's paint store, and a childhood friend of mine lived in that building. Homage to Puglia. Puglia, pronounced Puglia, is the region of my father's family. Is the region my father's family came from. It is also the name of a restaurant in New York's Little Italy. Located in Lower Manhattan, Little Italy is not to be confused with Italian Harlem, which was in uptown Manhattan. Little Italy was much smaller than Italian Harlem, but better known among tourists mostly because of its large concentration of quality restaurants. Today it still exists, while Italian Harlem has disappeared, now settled by other ethnic groups. But even Little Italy is shrinking away, yielding territory to Chinatown, expanding from the south, and Soho expanding from the west. There was one restaurant, the name of which I cannot recall, just above Little Italy in the southern part of Greenwich Village. It had a bocce court right inside the restaurant itself. That area of the South Village, as it was called, was also an Italian neighborhood, as was much of Greenwich Village. But it gave way to gentrification and high rents as the young professionals and gays moved in. Whenever I see a bocce game in progress, I think about an uncle of mine who played bocce with his neighbors in Staten Island. I was just an 11 or 12-year-old kid spending a couple of weeks out in the then rustic Staten Island with him and my aunt and some cousins. I loved to watch the games that these Italian men pursued with such flair. They would play boss and underboss, capo e sotto capo. It was the real thing. The court was pressed and smooth with a heavy earth roller. The bocce balls were made of solid wood, and most of the verbal exchanges between the players were in southern Italian dialect with a sprinkle of broken English. After each round of games, a bottle of wine was allocated to the victors to use as they wished. The boss, top winner, made the decisions about distributing the drinks. The underboss could not initiate decisions, but he could veto the boss's decisions. Grudges were often acted out. Sometimes the player forced to go dry by a rival would retaliate after the next round by denying a drink to that same rival if he had the opportunity. The games and wine allocations were high drama. All the bocce games I've watched since those summer days on Staten Island seemed tame and hardly authentic. The bocce court in the Greenwich Village restaurant felt disappointingly out of place. I did not enjoy seeing yuppie urbanites awkwardly playing bocce a few feet away while I was trying to savor my linguine and clam sauce. But it is Puglia, Ristorante, that I want to dwell upon. It had no bocce court, but it had almost everything else. I first chanced upon it while searching for a place that serves gabuzzella, in southern dialect, gabuzzel. Roasted sheep head or lamb head. The head of the sheep is sawed right down the middle. Each half is a serving in itself, with its crisp meat on the upper skull and jaw, rich tasting brains, a full-length half tongue, and a fatty eyeball. This was back in my untrammeled carnivore days. I have since moved away from meat consumption, but years ago, Capuzzella. I'm sorry.
He's a militant vegetarian.
Vegan.
But years ago, Capuzzella was a savage feast. The meat on the lamb skull was the tastiest and crispiest one could find, especially if well roasted in a brick or stone oven. The Greeks also ate capuzzella, though of course they called it something else. I once had capuzzella at a Midtown Greek restaurant. It was served completely boned with the meat, brain, tongue, and eye rearranged on the plate to simulate a sheep's head, but without the skull itself. For this feat, perhaps, the Greeks deserve some extra credit. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Puglia Ristorante was the only place I could find outside of East Harlem that served capuzzella. One could also order moilatelli, sheep's testicles on a skewer, and pasta e fagioli, a soup of macaroni and beans. Puglia was situated on Hester Street, right across from the old Umberto's Clam House, where mobster Crazy Joey Gallo was rubbed out by members of the Colombo gang in 1972. The story goes that Gallo was asking for it, traipsing around deep into Colombo territory, and then making the mistake of sitting in Umberto's with his back to the door, allowing the hitmen to get the jump on him. Puglia had other interesting features besides being situated near the site of a mafia hit. It was built in 1919. It had a brick oven that produced grand results with the roasted lamb. When I first discovered Puglia in 1959, it was completely non-gentrified, unreconstructed restaurant, looking much like a low-grade cafeteria with its long formica tables, old metal folding chairs, and tiled floor. It was patronized completely by local Italian Americans who stared at you if you were an outsider. The non-Italians had not yet discovered the place. I think it was I who brought the first Jews there, my close friends, Howard Kahn.
Who's right here.
He was right here.
40 years later, he's still bothering me.
And Sherman Miller, who tried to act as Italian as they could at Puglia Ristorante. Puglia's walls were adorned with amateur paintings that purported to be scenes from the old country. Over the door that led into the kitchen was a plaque with the owner's name, Gregorio Garofalo, and the place of his birth, Gravina di Puglia. I was delighted. Senor Garofalo, I called to the aging padrone. My father was born in Gravina, that very same town as you. I half expected him to leap up and embrace me, fighting back the tears of joy as we both explained in Barese dialogue, Paisano me, my countryman! Maybe followed by a complimentary glass of wine. Instead, he gazed blankly at me and then gave me a faint nod of acknowledgement and a grunt. The padrone was not impressed. The one marvelous feature about Puglia Ristorante was the cluster of elderly Italian immigrant men dressed in trim but well-worn black suits and black hats, white shirts, no ties, nursing glasses of wine or glasses of black coffee. From time to time, one another of these elders would rise from his seat and sing a southern ballad from the bottom of his heart and the top of his lungs. Vici un mare, fate more, ancora, in broad southern dialect vowels, all performed with a bursting sweep of sentimentality, yet without the slightest self-consciousness. The other men would listen attentively. After a short interval, another would rise and belt out another song of the same vintage. I was always happy when I went to Puglia Ristorante, drawn back into this precious yesterday, but the years took their toll. By the late 1970s, the restaurant was no longer the same. The non-Italians, including Ivy League students, came from all over the city and beyond. The old men had died off, so too the original owner, Garofalo. Arrivederci. On one occasion, while in Burlington, Vermont, in 1974, when I was running for U.S. Congress as a member of the Liberty Union Party, I was talking to a graduate student I knew. He mentioned he would be visiting New York. I told him that if he happened to make it down to Little Italy, there was an unusual and authentic little restaurant he might like. Oh, he said, matter-of-factly, you mean Puglia? My jaw dropped. Here in northern Vermont, a short drive from the Canadian border, this non-Italian, non-New Yorker, with so many Italian restaurants to choose from, mentions that one. I realized that Puglia had been discovered by the gringos. It was just a matter of time before it would all be over. As the years went on, the music of Puglia became greatly amplified. A stout lady sang pop American tunes through a microphone too loudly. In time, the menu grew more elaborate and less authentic, like the music. The singing was now done by local professionals adorned in shiny nightclub attire. Puglia was now the poor man's Las Vegas, pulling in tourist trade. The last time I got to Puglia Ristorante was in the autumn of 2010. It was my first visit in over 25 years, an accidental one. I'd spoken that day at a conference not far from Little Italy. It was a Saturday night, and the streets of Little Italy were full of strollers. I wandered along with the crowd, and to my happy surprise, came upon Puglia Ristorante. Do you still serve cabazzella? I asked the man at the door. Nah, he laughed. That was a long time ago. I nodded, turned away, and walked off. Footnote. Today on Minetto Lane in Greenwich Village, there's a restaurant named Perla where, quote, obscure peasant delicacies like roasted lamb's head are served as occasional specials, end quote. Reports New York Magazine, 30th of April, 2012. I still think of the old men of 1959. I recall their trim black suits and glasses of black coffee and their sad, sentimental songs, sung so perfectly without microphones, so possessed of something now lost. The thought of them still gives me a tug. I am reminded that yesterday never really returns, no matter how intently we search and wait. Coming home to both worlds. I mourned the loss of the authentic Italian-American world of New York, symbolized by the transformation of places like Puglia Ristorante. Yet I myself frequently looked beyond the horizon. In other words, I did not want outsiders intruding upon my ethnic enclosure, but I certainly wanted to go romping into their far-off gardens and pathways. Often during my childhood, I would wonder about the world beyond East Harlem, about the strange inhabitants of downtown, East Side Manhattan, tall, pink-faced, Anglo-Protestants who pronounced all their R's, patronized the Broadway theater and traveled to Europe for purposes other than to locate lost relatives. I would think of other unexplored worlds with anticipation. This intoxication of experiences yet to come left me with the keen feeling that East Harlem was not my final destination in life. I was not the only one preparing to pull up stakes and wander off to new terrain. Most of the Italians, including all my relatives, abandoned East Harlem in the late 1950s, moving to second settlement areas, leaving the old neighborhood to growing numbers of Puerto Rican and other Latino immigrants. The money the Italians had saved during the war years and post-war prosperity became the down payment passage to the mass-produced housing tracts of Long Island, Staten Island, Westchester County, and New Jersey, where as proud homeowners, they could live a life that approximated the middle-class suburban one they saw in the movies. But the new lifestyle had a downside to it. One uncle who used to have huge parties for friends and relatives in his home on 3rd Avenue, complete with mandolins and accordions, popular songs and operatic arias drawn from the amateur talents of the guests themselves, now discovered that no one came to visit him, marooned as he now was on the outer edge of Queens. An aunt of mine who lived all her life within shouting distance of at least 2 of her 4 sisters tearfully told my mother how lonely she was in Staten Island, out in the sticks. In time, I went off to graduate school and saw far less of my extended family as they did of each other. Years later, in 1968, I got a call from my cousin Anthony asking me to attend a family reunion, my mother's side of the family. As Anthony put it, it seems nowadays we only get together for weddings and funerals, and lately there have not been enough weddings and too many funerals. So here it was, a family reunion. It took place in his home in Queens, attended by a crowd of cousins and their 4th-generation children, the latter being youngsters whom I was meeting for the first time, and for whom East Harlem was nothing more than a geographical expression, if even that. Time had brought its changes. The women wore coiffures and stylish clothes, and the men looked heavier. There was much talk about recent vacations and a slideshow of Cousin Anthony's travels to Europe, also a fine buffet of Italian food that made the slideshow worth sitting through. And there were a lot of invitations to come visit us. Much to my disappointment, the older surviving aunts and uncles had decided to stay away because this was an affair for the younger people, an act of age segregation that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. In all, we spent a pleasant evening joking and catching up on things. It was decided we should get together more often, but we never did have another reunion. In the late 1970s, I began to have a recurring dream every few months or so. Unlike the recurring dreams portrayed in movies, in which the exact same footage is run and rerun, the particulars and fixtures of each dream in real life or real sleep differ, but the underlying theme is the same. In each dream, I find myself living in a fashionable New York apartment. Sometimes it had spiral stairwells and bare brick walls, and sometimes lavish wood paneling and fireplaces. But it always turned out to be an upscale renovation of my parents' simple apartment at 304 East 118th Street, the old brownstone in East Harlem where I spent much of my early life. We might think of recurring dreams as nightmarish, but these dreams of mine were accompanied by sensations of relief and yearning. Life past was being recaptured and renovated by the life now accomplished. The slum was being gentrified. The working class Italian youth and the professional class American academic were to live together under the same roof. I had come home to two worlds apart, never quite at home in either one. I would now have the best of both. Once I understood the message, the dream stopped. That end. I have something for you. I went by your building and took a photograph of your house on Friday.
Thank you so much. And this is the paint store right around
Yes,
the corner.
sure, that is
we used to play handball all the time.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And I have something to
And
carry.
I wrote this whole book not knowing and realizing that the house was still standing.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
It is.
Go back and visit.
Okay, next we have Roberto
Yes.
Ragone, who's going to be reading from Someone Else to Remember and Inventing Space.
Yes.
Roberto is a Bronx native who graduated from Bronx High School of Science and Harvard University. He has over 25 years of experience in New York State and local government and nonprofits, including stints with City Council, Mayor's Office, and State Senate. Let's give a warm thank you.
So first I'd like to acknowledge one thing about Ketty Romagnoli, who spoke, who read the Italian part of the poem. She's visiting from Bologna. She's been in communication with a gentleman named Renato Cantore, who is a journalist in Basilicata, which is the region of Italy where Leonard Cavello and Vito Marcantonio are from. And Renato has also been in touch with Gerald Meyer. And he is a very interesting barometer for how that region of Italy is now taking an interest in the, not only in the interest of Italian American immigrant history, but specifically the history of Italian Harlem and specifically Marcantonio and Cavello. So we can call her presence here as Vito Marcantonio from Basilicata to Bologna. There you go. Exactly right. So the other thing is that I was going to do a reading, and I typically, and I am doing a reading, but I typically do some dramatization of Marcantonio, and the initial plan was to not do that today. But I thought, today is Halloween. It is the day of the year the United States entitles you to be somebody you're not. So how can I not be Marcantonio today, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm doing two shorter readings from Michael Parenti's book. The first one is his reflections of two important leaders of Italian Harlem, which totally is a reflection of the mission and principles that we're trying to advance with the Vito Marcantonio Forum. But during that reading, I will interject a dramatization by Vito Marcantonio twice. Okay, so here we go. All right, this reading is section 32, Someone Else to Remember. My junior high school was housed in the same building as Benjamin Franklin High School, whose student body in those days was mostly Italian American. Both the junior and senior high schools were all boys. The high school principal was the noted educator scholar Dr. Leonard Cavello, a man who wanted to see Italian kids excel, not just so they might enjoy upward mobility and advance their personal fortunes. He wanted them also to make some kind of contribution to the community. Such was the case with Cavello's own career, an upwardly mobile educator, but also a community leader, wielding a downtown influence on behalf of East Harlem. One of Cavello's goals was to see that the various ethnic groups, Italians, blacks, Irish, Puerto Ricans, learned to live in peace with each other. One of his proteges was Vito Marcantonio, who much fulfilled the Cavello model of selective acculturation into the wider society. Impressive upward mobility with much personal accomplishment, yet retaining a strong attachment to his ethnic community roots. Marcantonio represented the 18th Congressional District, mostly East Harlem, in the U.S. House of Representatives. Among all the individuals ever to serve in Congress, Marcantonio took the most outspoken and persistently radical stances on behalf of working people, labor unions, ethnic minorities, world peace, public ownership, and social democracy. He could be judged also by the enemies he made: the moneyed interests, big landlords, corporations, fascists, militarists, imperialists, and reactionary witch hunters. Marcantonio's district was twice subjected to redistricting in the hope of defeating him at the polls. He had the audacity to join forces with the Communist Party on a number of issues in various electoral struggles. For this, he was red-baited mercilessly by political opponents and the mainstream media. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI amassed a huge file on Marcantonio and deliberated every year about putting him on the security index for detention in time of emergency. Mark, as his supporters called him, contested 9 congressional elections over the years, of which he won 7. In his last try for re-election in 1950, the Republican, Democratic, and Liberal parties joined together to back one candidate, a Republican named Donovan who lived downtown outside the 18th Congressional District on swanky East 58th Street. Running on the American Labor Party ticket, Mark still carried Italian Harlem, but lost what he rightly called the gang up, quote unquote. I remember the sympathy we all felt for him at the time. In his excellent biography of Marcantonio, Gerald Meyer observes, quote, "There is something distasteful and disquieting in the amount of power that was amassed to silence the only opposing voice in Congress," unquote. In my earliest years, I was suspicious of Marcantonio, fearing that he might indeed be a communist. My father saw him as, quote unquote, a man of the people who helped anyone who came to his office, including many who did not even live in the district. This was quite true and quite impressive. It certainly was enough to win Papa's vote. By the time I got to college, my politics had awakened sufficiently for me to become a Marcantonio supporter. Mark was born in East Harlem and lived all his life within a few blocks radius. He was a short man of slight build. His voice and diction carried a New York street nasality. Yet the fire and the content of his remarks were compelling. Late one night, when I was about 14 years old, I chanced upon a big rally being conducted at what was known as Mark's Lucky Corner on East 116th Street and Lexington Avenue. Given the hour and the venue, the crowd of 500 or more consisted almost entirely of men drawn from the surrounding Italian neighborhood. Several speakers addressed the crowd, each telling a story of how Mark had fought for some cause that directly helped him and others. Finally, Marcantonio himself took to the microphone and launched into one of his fiery speeches with deadly seriousness and scornful humor, striking blows at those atop the social pyramid. Mayor O'Dwyer's hogwash about communism is so silly and so hypocritical that he has made himself the laughing stock of the city of New York. For instance, he's been talking about my having Kremlin connections. Well, let's see. In 1945, Mr. O'Dwyer asked me to obtain the nomination of the American Labor Party for him. In 1948, only a little over a year ago, he asked me to nominate his own brother for Congress. Well, if it's true, as he says, that I take orders from the Kremlin, what does that mean? It means that he got the Kremlin to order me to nominate him and his brother. Now, as for Newbold Morris, who seeks to sneak into City Hall under LaGuardia's old overcoat, he is the candidate of the very two men who stamped LaGuardia in the back in 1945, Dewey and Dubinsky, the governor and the Liberal Party leader. Why, if Fiorello LaGuardia were alive today, I say he would have picked up a baseball bat and he would have chased Newbold Morris all the way from City Hall to Dyckman Street.
Right away, Mark.
So All right, then Mr. Parenti continues with a parenthetical sentence saying, I recall thinking to myself that someday I might be addressing large audiences. So in the middle of Mark's speech, something most unusual happened. A caravan of cars shooting sparklers, flashing bright lights, blasting melodious horns and wild music, and sending balloons aloft came rolling up Lexington Avenue from Spanish Harlem, right alongside the large crowd gathered on 116th Street. It was a Puerto Rican invasion. Feelings between the Puerto Rican and Italian communities at the time were strained, as is often the case when low-income ethnic enclaves find themselves competing for housing, schools, and recreational areas. The Italians saw the Puerto Ricans as encroaching. The Puerto Ricans saw the Italians as shutting them out. Now, here they were, those wild Puerto Ricans rolling a blazing cavalcade right into the middle of Mark's talk and into the middle of Italian Harlem. Would he react with fury at the interruption? No. He flashed them a big smile and waved vigorously and shouted an extended, rousing welcome in Spanish. By now, it was obvious that the invasion from Spanish Harlem was a friendly one. Those were Mark's supporters, and he had been expecting them all along. Now, what happened next was something I shall never forget. As if of one mind, the large crowd of Italian-American men all turned towards the caravan rolling up Lexington Avenue and broke into thunderous applause and deep-throated cheers. At that moment, we realized that the Puerto Ricans were not our competitors. They were our allies. In addition, we probably were impressed and proud that Mark could marshal such enthusiastic support from Spanish Harlem. Now, many politicians divide the common people against each other. Mark brought them together, showing them their mutual interests, which was one of the reasons he was so hated by the powers that be. Mayor O'Dwyer promised that he would guarantee equal treatment to our Puerto Rican citizens. Instead, what has he done? He has neglected them for 4 long years. He singles them out for investigation, and he has been continuously relegating them to the position of second-class citizenship. Yes, I do defend the Puerto Ricans as I most recently arrived. I defend them against the same kind of discrimination that was practiced against my Italian grandfather when he came to this country in 1886. The same kind of discrimination that was practiced against the Jewish people. The same kind of discrimination that was practiced against the Irish people. Yes, I fight against discrimination against all people. And O'Dwyer has despicably seen fit to try to condemn me because of my defense of these recently arrived immigrants who are the victims of the vilest kind of exploitation on the part of the corporations of our own Wall Street. All right. Let's see. Okay, the Puerto Rican population of East Harlem in the late 1940s largely supported Vito Marcantonio because he was on the side of the renters and workers, not the landlords and bosses. He fought for the inclusion of Puerto Rico in the 1939 extension of the Social Security Act. He fought for job programs for Puerto Rican immigrants and for a minimum hourly wage in Puerto Rico, and numerous other legislation for the island's inhabitants. In his first House speech in 1936, he declared, quote, "Puerto Rico is the most tragic victim of American imperialism," unquote. People loved Mark because he meant it. He also lived it. He worked tirelessly to building an effective organization that was both a political machine and a social service agency. His office in East Harlem was always open to people in need. He put in 14-hour days and never took a real vacation through his political career. In 1954, at the age of 52, he burned out While getting ready to launch a campaign for mayor, he fell dead in the street. I went to his funeral, waiting in the long line to pass his open casket. Get very emotional about Marcantonio. Thank you. I mean, I think I'm also empathizing with your moment, right? Then out in the street, I found myself in a conversation with a saddened African-American woman. She told me how much inspiration and clarity Mark had brought into everything, and how she would miss him. We both missed him already. Vito Marcantonio goes unnoticed in the official political history of this nation, but he was loved and mourned by hundreds of thousands. For some of us, he remains unmatched. And I will never forget that night on the Lucky Corner when that entire crowd of Italian men did a left face towards Lexington Avenue and gave a heartfelt cheers and applause to their newly acquired Puerto Rican allies, just as Mark wanted. So that's the first reading. So there you go. Thank you, Mr. Parenti, for that. And by the way, so we had the opportunity to see that particular quote and a couple of others, both in the context of Stephen's analysis and then right in the book. So that's a good cross-reference, I think, for people. I think that's great. The second piece I'd like to read is very short. And the reason this one, I mean, there were so many things in this book that struck me that if I got to read excerpts from different parts of this book, like the one about the comparison between Lucky Luciano and Mother Teresa and how America... Mother Cabrini, excuse me. And the selective treatment of the two was a very interesting exercise in selective perception and cognitive dissonance. But the other one that struck me was it's called Inventing Space. And because when I read it, it really struck me because when I was a kid, I shouldn't even say when so that I don't date myself on camera, right? But when we were playing certain games and we had certain street activities, when I grew up, I became a bit more introspective about how far back in time some of this stuff was going on. Because when I was a kid, you know, some of the advertising was still very 1950-ish, and some of the reruns were still very 1950-ish. So you wondered, like, what kind of continuity there was. Because it's amazing how much of that continuity remained until, let's say, in some even intact Italian neighborhoods into like the early 1980s. There's some kind of a line you could draw between what's written in this book in the early 1980s before the yuppie became an official category, the Reagan era, and then around that time basically the Puglia becoming a tourist trap. And then by the time the hipsters and the internet rolled around, it was like the death knell of that continuity. But what I'm going to read, which is a very short passage called, again, Inventing Space, there are elements of that past that you can actually trace. This could be the 30s and 40s. This could very well have been the 70s and early 80s, which is why it struck me. Inventing Space. Like most congested low-income areas, East Harlem was a lively but somewhat rough place to inhabit. We youngsters were street kids, in the true sense of that term. We spent our after-school hours on the streets. Our sports consisted of boxball, punchball, stickball, stoopball, handball, roller skating, ring-a-levio, Johnny on the pony, kick the can, hide and seek, and the like. All these activities took place in the streets or on the sidewalks. One nice thing about these being street kids is that we were not under constant adult supervision. We were left alone enough to devise our own disportment. Most children today have little space for spontaneous frolic. Even if they play baseball, it is the Little League, same with soccer, hockey, or whatever. They are smothered with coaches, teachers, and parents all shouting directives and encouragement from the sidelines. The kids look miserable. In East Harlem, we invented or inherited our own street games and our own street culture. On the rare occasions when adults watched, they usually kept their distance. As if on cue, at one time of year or another, all the kids would appear on the street with tops. and we would be spinning tops for a week or so. At another time, we would all start playing marbles right along the dirty street curbs. Weeks later, everyone was flipping, trading baseball cards. Then, after some quiet time, quote unquote, we would be out on our roller skates, metal ones clamped to one's shoes, spinning the asphalt as if our lives depended on it. Very few of us could afford our own bicycles, but there was a bike store nearby, and suddenly, as if orchestrated by an invisible hand, it would be bike season, and we would all be tearing around the streets on rented bikes. This might be followed by a week when kites were all the rage. We would trek across the Triborough Bridge to Randall's Island and to fly our newly acquired kites. Who orchestrated these recreational fads, if anyone? I never knew. It would have to, but it seemed to have its own communal rhythm. Our survival, by the way, the only game that was missing in here is Skelsey with the street top. So I don't know if that came out in a later generation. So, but I relate to every one of these games in the street. Exactly, right. Chris knows Skelsey, exactly. I had to put in a plug for Skelsey, I'm sorry. So our survival depended on the ability to dodge cars and stay out of serious trouble. Our gangs were informally organized, and while capable of a variety of roughhouse activities, none of us carried guns or would ever think of doing so. We were not only drug-free, we had never heard of narcotics. But, of course, we street kids did perform acts of dash and daring that sometimes went beyond the bounds of good sense. Every so often, a boy would sustain serious injury by leaping from one tenement rooftop to another without quite making it, or falling while climbing fire escapes or while catwalking high walls and fences. Other mishaps included running into the path of a vehicle or hitching a ride on the back of a trolley or a bus and falling off. In whatever way we could, we tried to accommodate ourselves to an unaccommodating environment. The street belonged to the omnipresent automobile, of which there are not as many as today. The sidewalks belonged to the adult pedestrians, the hallways to the janitors and tenants, the storefronts to the store owners, and even the schoolyard was locked up soon after 3 p.m. We kids lived in the neighborhood's interstices, right. You know something? I had to actually look up interstices, right. I looked up the pronunciation of that word in Google pronunciation, and I still got it wrong today. Okay. But anyway, it's a great word. Constantly inventing and reinventing spaces of our own. Empty lots, stoops, cellars, backyards, street corners, and the fronts of abandoned stores. All right, last paragraph. The youths I knew, I'm pronouncing it like, yeah. The youths I knew, ages 9 to 19 or so, spent most of their time on our block, 118th Street. We gathered on the steps of the old abandoned church or in front of the candy store, or where the sidewalk widened because two houses were built further back from the street, or on one or another large stoop, or at night under the lamppost after the dice game was over, talking, joking, arguing, boasting, and kidding each other. There was no end to the verbal exchanges. Here was certain proof that we were of Italian lineage. We never stopped talking. The end. For now.
The presentation, please.
Michael, would you like to do some reading?
Thank you very much for reading all those, so generously reading all those selections from the book. I mean, some would call it plagiarism, but I appreciate it, really. And I'm going to read two little passages. There's a couple of things I want to say. The book has a lot of humor in it, and I don't think that comes across that easily when you just get a cut of a piece that's about a drum and snap, and we want to talk about the meaning of it. But I wrote it actually with a care to humor, because the human comedy is that. It's a human comedy, even in the unhappiest moments at times. For instance, like on the religion thing with the church, I have sections called Paradise Lost. Another chapter is called Jesus Was a Roman Catholic. You know, we were taught that. I mean, Jesus, and we were on a winning team in that case. You know, Protestants. Got it. And so there was this kind of fun. I also dealt with some historical mysteries. I have a chapter called How Italy Won World War I. And I make a case about it. They did. They beat the Austrians, of all people, and a couple of German divisions, too, in World War I. But more fascinating was how the next chapter was how Italy won World War II. And that's a harder one to argue, because the Italian army was smashed and all that. But there was a very interesting thing. The Italian army and the victorious Nazi fascist armies of Bulgaria, Hungary, and such and all that occupied most of Europe at this time. The Italians had a chunk of France, a southern piece of France, just before Vichy, and they had a piece of Greece and one other country, I forget where.
Albania.
What? Albania. And in each of these cases, it's a very interesting point. I just mention it, but it's a very interesting thing that should be researched. I've never seen it researched. The one source I used was Susan Zuccotti's book. Zuccotti, she's not Italian. I immediately said, is she Jewish? She said, no, she's not Jewish. She's something else. I know it's her husband's name. But she mentions this, that the Italian junior officers in these occupational forces throughout these countries, all the way from France to Greece, refused to carry out the Holocaust. They refused to round up Jews. In fact, what they did was okay passports, give them phony passports. If the name was anywhere remotely Italian sounding, they gave them a stamp of Italian. They almost never used the word Jew. So there was this tremendous gathering them up and sending them back and funneling them through Italy to avoid the Holocaust. It's a remarkable thing how that got coordinated and how it was happening among junior officers, and that junior officers are lieutenants and captains in the Italian army. It's a story untold, and all I do is allude to it. So there's all sorts of things. A lot of them are little vignettes or box inserts. The book, as someone pointed out, is 150. It has 47 chapters, but it's only 150 pages. So you can imagine, it makes for quick reading and the like. I'm going to read something about how the diversity. One of the themes I touch on all the time are the diversities of different ethnic groups, that you have pride in and enjoyment in your own group, but not by excluding other groups and we're better than them. That we're better than them stuff is, Columbus Day is not a day I'm going to go rah, 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 and then that kind of thing. So here it is, just a box insert. And one of the protagonists in this little box insert is sitting right over there. Again, my friend Howard Kahn, who we already heard about how he helped me crash Puglia restaurant and eat cabozzelle as two outsiders, because I was an outsider too at the time. Okay. Departing from the family is not always an easy thing. It varies with ethno-class backgrounds. I recall talking with two friends of mine in the late 1970s. One of them was Bill Cartwright, not his real name, who came from an upper-crust Nordic Protestant background. Choate, Amherst College, Harvard Law, the whole 9 yards. He said that when he announced he was leaving home, his affluent father gave him a wad of money and a pat on the back and wished him luck. That was quite different from my experience, as I told my two friends. When I informed my working-class Italian father that I was leaving, he threatened to kill me. You can't shame the family. You can't abandon the family. He thundered. I mean, I was quite shaken. In any case, I did leave, only to a small apartment several blocks away, still in the Bronx. I couldn't afford Manhattan. which eased my father's anguish and apparently left him feeling less homicidal. The third person in this exchange was my dear friend Howie Kahn. Let's hear a round of applause for Howie. Okay. All right, that's enough. It goes right to his head. The third person in this exchange was my dear friend Howard Kahn, who said, well, when I announced to my Jewish father that I was leaving home, he threatened to kill himself. And then he had a nosebleed. So my closing wrap-up line is, it takes all kinds of stereotypes to build a great nation. And here's the very last thing I'm going to read to you. It's just 3-line paragraph. Oh, you don't want to hear about how the guidette, the Italian girls, are treated, do you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's hear that.
Well, you know, one of the stereotypes that left for us is the Jersey kid, the Guido. That's become a generic name. The Guido, he's the guy who sits around and makes love to his own muscles. Hey, don't you want a partner or something for that? No? And he's Guido, and he talks like that, you know. And then his girlfriend is a guidette, known as guidette. And well, Guido is visceral, emotive. He spends his best walking hours chasing chicks, quote, quote. The guidette concentrates on doing her nails, adjusting her heaps of dark hair, and getting laid. It is a long-standing stereotype, the hot, not very classy Italian female. For years, the joke was, what do you do when an Italian girl wants to have sex with the lights on? Answer, open the car door. That's terrible. I know, it's a terrible joke. And I heard that from well, I won't tell you who I heard it from. Okay, this is the closing line that I wanted to point out, and it gives a new point. Not all generalizations made about ethnic groups are negative. I mean, there are positive views of them too. Some actually can be complementary of generalizations. Thus, Italians are often seen as warm, outgoing, compassionate, musically gifted, of generous spirit, and dedicated to the family. Don't we all agree with that, right? No. There is not a single, dedicated to the family. Italian men have been described as devilishly attractive and superb lovers. There is not a single recorded instance of any Italian male challenging this stereotype. and I end it there. Thank you so much. I hope you buy the book. I think you'll really enjoy it. Q&A. We got to do Q&A.
Yeah, we'll do a quick.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, we have Michael with us, as well as the presenters. If anyone would like to raise a question and direct it, Jerry?
I'd love if before, we don't want anyone to leave, we have something really nice to give to Michael, you know, so I was hoping that we could present that to him.
Sure.
I got a very nice gift already.
More gifts.
Oh my gosh.
And this was designed by one of our members, Gabrielle Napolitano, who couldn't make it today.
Oh, that's good. Well, damn nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Meyer, for...
Stefan has to come. No, he has to come. No,
give it to the people who have to get on a plane.
You have to come. But you have to come up and get it. You have to give it back.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Can you hold it up for me?
You have to do this right.
Yes.
Get the whole thing.
All right. Well, you know something.
I'm very ceremonial.
Okay. Here you go, sir. Thank you very much.
Who designed this?
This was designed by Gabrielle Napolitano, and you know, our organization is really, you know, we exist all through people contributing time, and it's all volunteer work. So thanks to everyone in the Vito Marcantonio Forum. You know, thank you, Michael Parenti, for joining us. And
Thank you. I want want to point out in this little room of people, and I don't know most of the people in this room. Well, Christopher Bell.
I got one question.
Yes, but I want to just say, Christopher Bell, who's written some marvelous things about East Harlem and such, is probably the best historian on it, I would say. And there he is, sitting very modestly and quietly. And he wants to ask a question, you see. But before we do, Chris, I just want to say we have Bertel Ullman here, who was a leading Marxist political scientist and scholar who's done a lot of work there. We have Barry Latucci, who finally made it out of bed and got here at about 3 o'clock, you know. And that's because Joe Friendly was doing the driving. Is that what?
No, I did the driving.
Oh, and Joe Friendly, a noted photographer, who's right back there taking everybody's picture. So we have a very nice, and of course, and then the people who've been highlighted here, reading my pages. Yes, what did you want to say, Chris?
You went to the same school as Vito Marcantonio, PS 85. Did anyone ever mention that Mark
PS 85? He went to PS 85?
Yes, he did.
He and I both went to the same high school, DeWitt Clinton High School.
Yeah. Did anybody ever mention that Vito Marcantonio went to the same school that you attended? And
no.
Public school, high school, or something?
Nobody's ever, except maybe today, but nobody's made any mention of me in regard to Marcantonio. I was only a kid.
Yeah, I was wondering,
was it
anybody
like
ever
were they
talk
proud
about
to live in the school? Is kind of what
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Did someone like ever say, well, you Vito Marcantonio, the congressman went to school here? Or maybe wasn't, what's he, yeah.
No, I don't remember. I don't remember any of that.
So, okay, because he was in Congress when you went to school.
Yes, that's right. I think he had just starting. Yes, yeah. He was making one of his many comebacks. That's what I remember. Well, anybody? Do we want to do Q&A now? Just a few questions, if there are. Yes.
Yeah. I remember Jim Foreman of SNCC saying one time that he thought that the way we could raise class consciousness in the U.S. was along ethnic lines. And I just wonder what your reflections were on that.
That we could do what along ethnic lines?
We could raise class consciousness, which is kind of a problem in the U.S. sometimes. We don't have a lot of class consciousness.
No, I think you could show how the ethnic defilements and abuses and insults are connected to class abuses too, because they'll readily hear the ethnic ones, and I don't think you should emphasize that as being, oh, they're just doing this to us because we're Italians. No, they did the same thing to Poles and Irish and blacks and Puerto Ricans and the like. So, and Marcantonio was for bringing them together. You know, Marcantonio, this is something Jerry pointed out in his book, I think is most unknown fact. He brought Social Security to Puerto Rico, or he fought. He was the guy who fought to make sure that Puerto Ricans were covered as U.S. citizens, and it was a blessing. I mean, the Social Security system is probably the most effective program we have in fighting poverty. As inadequate as it is, it's probably the best. It's inadequate because it's of course being freighted all the time by these guys. They take it away. Because in fact it has about a $5 or $6 trillion surplus in it. Well, they keep talking about how we got to cut it and tighten it. They're doing this now. No COLA this coming year, it seems, for many people. No cost of living allowance, COLA. Yeah.
Hi, Michael, I want to thank you so very much from us coming here and this wonderful presentation, which is now being filmed widely and which we will circulate very, very widely. And the book is so rich and so extraordinary. And I would like to ask not only that people buy the book, but that people review the book. And I think a very good way, many people here are very developed, published writers, Chris and Bertel and others, but and Gil, and so on. But I think that we should all try our hand at that. It's an awful good way to start writing, is to write reviews. And it's a very big responsibility for us, because we want to disseminate what we've heard today. We're a modest group of people, we have the film, but we really have, I think, a responsibility to review these books and get them published. It's not hard to do. We have ideas on that if you want to, we can talk about that. And get the word out about this wonderful progressive production, creative production, that's so epitomized by Michael's wonderful, wonderful book. It meant the world to me, actually, and I appreciate it. And I think on the ethnic piece, and I think it's there, is my guess is the best way in America, at least, to get to class consciousness is probably through the ethnic side door. There's more solidarity among ethnic people, and so you can kind of transfer it. I mean, it takes some intervention. If it's left to itself, it doesn't happen, but with some intervention, probably working class people from an ethnic background, this is empirically evidence, are much more likely to move to the left and so on. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for the kind words. Should I be calling on the people?
Yeah, piggybacking on that comment about ethnicity and the way to mobilize class consciousness, in the book, in the excerpts, you kind of allude to your relatives who moved to suburbanized settings and the alienation, Staten Island, New Jersey. And it seems like in that kind of post-World War II, the way ethnicity for Italian Americans have been mobilized is in a very reactionary direction. I was just reading, before I came, a piece you had done on Newark, where I live now, and you had Anthony Imperiali, neo-fascists, who kind of mobilized that ethnic identity for deeply reactionary ends. In Staten Island, likewise.
And
it's this, we're besieged, we're discriminated against, and in a very reactionary end. So I don't know if you could maybe speak to that kind of transformation, the way ethnicity has been mobilized compared to Marcantonio and the way the current crop uses it.
Yeah, there was even a book, and I can't remember the title. I owned the book. I read it. It was about how the subtitle was something about how the Irish, Italians, and Jews rebelled against the Democratic Party. It was with the busing and all this, and in suburbia, it was happening to all of them, even the Jews, who were very, very strong attachment to the Democratic Party. The only way to get around that is, in a way, I think, downplaying the ethnic theme there, and pointing out that these people need assistance and they have a right for a turn at the bat and all that. And the answer always comes up is, we never got any welfare, we never got any supplements, income supplements or anything. We had to work a second job, still do. So it's very hard. What?
It was a shame to do that, to take help.
That's right. That's right. Can you hear her? She said it was a shame to take help. It was a shame, yeah. And when they found out things like they're almost losing their house, but then they can get help on that, and all, they started softening their views about that and saying, well, maybe help from the government is good, because they were getting some of the help and saving their hides in doing it. Take the case of the Columbus Day thing. They gave us Columbus. My friend John Rocco Lombardi, he would say, when we had the Italian American Historical Association, remember that, which is now a different name.
IASA. It's called IASA, Italian American Studies Association.
Now it's now Italian American Studies Association. They took out the word historical and all that. But back in those days, there was always some guy who got up. He usually was a judge from New Jersey. Nothing against New Jersey, and he'd say, we got this bridge across it's got to be called the Verrazzano. No, I guess the Verrazzano was already in, but there was some other highway or bridge that he wanted a name for. And I remember Rocco Lombardi leaning over to me and saying, another statue for Columbus, you know, like this, another statue for Columbus. And that's the kind of politics we got, and those were like our victories. We get another statue for Columbus. So now it's coming out, and it's not just Italians, but non-Italians are looking at it saying Columbus was a murderer and a nasty, and then just quoting his accounts and what he wrote to King Ferdinand about how to kill these people, enslave them, and how they submit to it. And all. It's an incredible testimonial that he gave perfectly. They make perfect slaves. They are honest and sweet and trusting and caring and all that. We could hit them real hard and just get the most out of them. And nobody would support Columbus if they knew what Columbus was doing. It's sort of like a lot of the Republican GOP leaders. Nobody would support them if you knew what they were really doing. You know, they're really pathetic. I mean, when they make Donald Trump look good, you know, you can give you an idea. Okay, yeah, Bertel. Oh,
You've written 23 books.
25. You did that on purpose. He likes to bait me, you know.
24 of them. 24 of them are clearly, directly, obviously political. Then you write an autobiography. What did you think you could do? What did you want to do? What was it important to do that you weren't able to do as well as you would have liked? In the other books, which were more directly political, that you thought you could do more and better in an autobiography?
I don't think I did that. I think I just did it out of love and remembrance, and poignant is a word that reviewers have used, that, you know, and humorous. It's a chance to really lighten up and to play with life, which we should be able to do. So I don't think I was charting another path to politicize, but I think it does politicize people, much more so than I thought. And I don't really think that, I really don't know, this book is not a treatment of the development of a political personality, you know. Oh, you heard Mark talk on street corners, and that's why you became a fiery radical who's talked. I have talked on open street corners and amplifiers and all. No, that's not true. I don't see it. Oh, I got this from 118th Street or this, that. I don't think it works that way. I think it's much more complicated, and I think cognition plays a greater role than just these imprints from your childhood or whatever else. I mean, I should have become a fiery revolutionary when you think of that education I got in grade school. Well, I did become a fiery revolutionary, matter of fact. I got kicked out of some of the best universities in America. I didn't go into all of that here, but well, what did I say? Got kicked out of some of the best schools in America, and I stopped applying for jobs. I got turned down where I had outpublished the whole department. I mean, the whole department adding up all their publications and looked at mine, even for scholarly journals that I'd written for. The APSR, I published in twice, full-length articles and such. And I got turned down, and I realized, hey, this stuff about publish or perish, there's another one called Publish and Perish. I didn't go into all that. I may do something more on that.
Can I ask a short question?
Yeah.
Were you at all influenced by Jesus Cologne or by Maxim Gorky? When I was reading it, they came to mind.
No, I've never read either of them.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I think you channeled them.
I must have channeled.
And I think the leftism is in those authors very, very much, or maybe in Nexel too. I mean, in the sense of you're dignifying working class life and showing that there's a working class culture that's really been smothered, and and that somehow the raw material for leftism is there, but again requiring some intervention.
Right, it needs to be tapped in some way.
Yeah,
But thinking about it, I sat when I was a kid with no politics of any kind. I went upstairs to my uncle Anthony's house. Everybody was sitting around talking down, hadn't started dinner, and I found a book in my cousin Mickey's room. I was stretching out to take a nap. I found a book in his room, and it was called Christ in Concrete. And the title was so intriguing, and it was written by Pietro Di Donato, who has spoken at the IACM. He's dead now, isn't he? He's gone.
Yeah, so he was a communist.
He had joined the party.
He joined the party. I didn't know that.
The
Wow.
day Sacklerman said he was executed.
But here's the point. I got this book. I have zero. I'm I'm in junior high maybe or something, or the 6th or 7th grade. 8th. And I started reading it, and when the kid gets angry and he turns to, about the priest, le prêtre du double menton, the French call it, the priest of the double chin, well fat and fed, and while the rest of us are starving, I got a surge go in me. I liked that attack on this. I had nothing against the priest and such, and yet I could see the favoritism. And that's happened a number of times. When I was a freshman at City College, I was reading an account of shop girls, working girls, how they're treated by their patrons, their richer patrons who come in and order them around, and their indignation. And again, it was a class fight. I mean, that whole area, you're experiencing that, but it's never talked about. I mean, it's so successfully repressed in American society that, and to be able to come out and really talk about what it means to be poor, what it means to be mistreated in this way, and how it could be so unequal. So in that sense, you do when you get tapped on things. And with Marcantonio, I was against him. I thought he was a communist, and my father loved Marcantonio, and he said, "No, he's not a communist. What's the matter with you? How could the guy be so good and stands up for us, the working people? How could he stand up for the working people and be a communist?" Well, in fact, that's what they do, you know. But I did have to say that Pop was right. I mean, some years later, I said, "Pop, I'm on your side. You and me from Marcantonio." Yeah.
Yes. I was wondering, over the years of your activism, have you encountered negative or stereotypical attitudes against white working class people? I was thinking of Italians from the left. Is that something that you've encountered?
No, but we know about it. We know that they often can be very reactionary and not understand. The point is not to ask for their pity and their sympathy for other groups. The point is to get them to understand how the interests of these other groups are also their interests too. And the mistreatment of those other groups, your ass is next then. You're going to get it next just as badly.
Well, I was talking about within leftist currents, negative attitudes within the left towards white working class people. I'm thinking of Italians too.
Oh, well, I don't know. You would mean field workers, organizers who get in there?
Dismissing the white working class as being hopelessly reactionary.
That's liberal professors that do that.
Yeah, well, sometimes these groups were frightening. Like in the Vietnam War, they would come out like real cafone, by the way. I hate that term because you know what cafone really means? It means a farmer, right, a hard-working guy, and to use that word to mean slob or whatever. There must be a better word, but my Italian is almost non-existent. So, but come out and charge into the lines. I mean, I've had that happen, you know. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I guess the flip side of your question, though, would be, let's say you're Italian American, you wanted to be involved with radical movements. So did the non-Italians look at you and say, well, you know, how can they thought of you more as like some strange anomaly and were kind of patronizing about this Italian American who wanted to be involved with a leftist or radical movement?
Yeah, well, with me that didn't happen.
Didn't happen. Okay.
This Italian American with a PhD from Yale wants to, you know, I was already, you know, teaching and academia and all, which is, my roots were working class, and I would always say it and be proud of it. But yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, we know that they depend on racism and ethnicitisms and all these sort to divide the working class in every way. They use religion. For a century, they played on what? Popery. Remember that with the Irish? For a century, the white Northern European descended working class, and there was a working class in Appalachia and all over the place. They learned to hate the Irish, hate and fear the Irish, who was the worst trait about the Irish was they were not just drunkards and belligerent and this and that and low life, but they were Catholics. Oh my God, Catholics, you know, and they papists, popery. So we just have to counterattack on those very same things. Wait, let's ask for Nancy. Yeah. Are you still recovering from the meat thing?
Barely.
Okay,
Barely.
go ahead.
Well, just piggybacking on what was just said about the class divisions and ethnicity, I'm wondering in your studies if you did encounter the aspect of our sister and brother animals being used to blur class lines by, for example, you know, if a working class person could afford to eat meat, you know, they were less likely to fight against the boss's oppressions. And so that whole aspect of the oppression of another and the animals, our sister and brother animals, being the most oppressed, the most exploited, and the most central in accepting, well, you're an animal, like calling some ethnic group, you know.
You mean if you feel free enough to abuse animals in this manner, you will be free enough to abuse certain elements of your fellow human beings.
Right, and to associate like women with the more one is associated, one class, one gender, one ethnicity is associated with the most dominant, the more you can oppress them or put them down or divide them further. And the opposite is used, so that working class people, when they got to eat meat, like the Joneses next door, they thought they had come. They didn't need a cape,
yeah,
a top hat. They were meat eating now.
Right, and that was the sign of eating well and eating better.
Success, right. So they didn't need to fight against poor wages and working conditions.
Right.
They had made it.
Well, you know, that's an issue that is related, but it's got to be engaged on its own merits too, and its own arguments. You have to attack the factory farming and the abuse of animals and such, and you can work in as a refrain, sort of, and that those who treat animals this way will treat other people this way, and but that's the point, is the animals and.
But the point is the class structure, that class nature, and that it's based on first the oppression of our sister and brother animals.
Except there are people in the more favored class, some of them who go to college and who are become vegans and vegetarians themselves.
Right. But as a class, they gained dominance first through dominating animals in history, through dominating animals. For example, the horse, domesticating, we call it, the horse, domesticating it, using it to ride ransack over Europe, India, and Asia.
Well, we could discuss that.
That's David
because
the
Plains Indians had horses and rode them masterfully, certainly far better than the 7th or 9th Cavalries that General Custer stumbled along and went and got himself killed.
From the Europeans.
They
first.
Did they?
No,
Indians, American Indians had the horses first. It
No,
did
no,
not come
Spanish.
from, it did not come from Europe,
No, they're not native, and the Spanish brought them
Mine is
over,
Spanish.
along with their domesticated cattle.
Well,
No.
let's,
Go to the Museum of
we're gonna
American
have
Indians,
to,
you'll read about it.
Get Wikipedia.
we're gonna have to move, we'll have to move on.
I was just wondering, when I was very fascinated by your reconstruction of the entire family at the very beginning is just masterful, and I congratulate you so much for that. And the small business part, you know, that both of the grandfathers are, they're small, they're involved, particularly on your paternal side, with the small business and going in and out of it, and then your father going in and out of small business,
Right.
Entrepreneurial work, and not succeeding. It's very interesting, and it seems to be very.
Well, what is it, about 9,000 businesses fail every week in
Yes,
America?
but it seemed very pre-capitalist. You know, going back to Southern Italy.
Yeah.
Very, very pre-capitalist about craft and small, small trade. You know, within a paese. You know, to have that with, but then when your father opens this venture, I think as I recall, it was some kind of candy store, and you lived for a while in the Bronx.
A bread store.
A bread store, right, yes.
Yeah.
And then you lived for a while in the Bronx, and then you returned. Am I right? Am I remembering this?
No, I never
Recalling
returned
this?
to Harlem.
You didn't return. So you went to the Bronx, but then did not come back to East Harlem.
Well, only because my father lived there, and I went and
So you visited him?
No, I lived with him, and then I moved to next door to him in the
I
Bronx
see.
for a while.
I see.
He gave me a hand in getting through my doctorate. I had to finish my doctorate.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's a little hard for me to get that.
Yeah. No, I didn't get it. I didn't get into that too much.
First, I'd like to put in a plug for the book by saying that whenever at book presentations, whenever the appeal is made for buying a book, people don't necessarily ask themselves, can I not only can I buy the book for myself, but who else can I buy this book for as a gift? So keep that question in mind, right? Since the holidays are coming. So my question is, my plug for the book.
Right away, I'll schmear you later.
Okay, sorry. This was not staged. Anyway, so the question is, what's interesting is that I remember, so you're describing also in detail, like, some of these terrible experiences you had with these teachers, which again, you could draw a line between that and the 1970s. But here you were having these experiences with teachers who were kind of arbitrary, and they weren't particularly competent in teaching, and your school was housed in the same building as Benjamin Franklin High School. Meanwhile, you have this innovative educator, Leonard Cavello. So I felt like you were going through kind of like this bizarro world, antithetical experience in school in the midst of like this great innovative leader. So I was just wondering, when you wrote the book and you were reflecting on education, right? Like, to what extent were you using kind of Leonard Cavello was sort of a prism as part of your reflections about how your own education was?
When I was a student there, Leonard Cavello never really was an inspiration to me. He was just this solemn guy who came out, and in fact, he was the principal of Benjamin Franklin High School.
Right.
I was in James Otis Junior High School, and he wasn't. But he had authority of the whole area. I mean, he whacked me once or twice, and then fast forward about 30 years, and I met him at one of the conferences of the Italian American Historical Association. He was a founder. I didn't even know that. And there I saw him, and he had a beret on. Yeah, remember that beret, and sort of the sleek. I mean, and he had a cane with a pearl handle on it. So, I mean, he was like
distinguished.
He was Italian. That's what he was just doing. He was the snazziest guy on the boulevard. 85 years old, something, whatever it was. I don't know. And it was amazing to meet him, and he also was the author of a remarkable dissertation on the Italian child in New York, which Nathan Glazer rested on. Glazer called me up and said, "Would you like to write the section?" I and Moynihan, what's Moynihan's first? Daniel Moynihan. We're doing a book on the melting pot. The unmelting pot. What is it?
Beyond the melting pot.
Beyond the melting pot, and would you like to do the chapter on? He came to see me. He decided I was too young, I think. I was just finishing my own dissertation. He said, and I just discovered Covello's dissertation, and that's got all the material I need. And I thought, well, what do you know? Leon Covello, I never knew he was a scholar and such. But I didn't have any connection to him.
Right.
It was nice seeing him. It was kind of fascinating to see him, 30 years later and all.
Right.
You sort of feel like a Rip Van Winkle, like the world just has gone by so much. And I'm 82 now, and I'm saying, how did that happen? How did that happen?
You're still alive.
I'm still alive. You know Studs Terkel, what he had to say about this? Some of my friends have heard it. But Studs Terkel, he came out of Chicago, but he was a New York boy, if you hear his accent. He's New York. He was New York all the way. He said, there's 3 stages to a man's life: youth, middle age, and you're looking great. So I'm just looking great, right? I think I'll stop now. You have other people want to speak. Thank you very much.
Well, we've come to the end of our program. If anyone would like to be added to our mailing list, please give me their email. And there's some biscotti that I brought from Astoria, and of course there's some books. And like I said, we'll be presenting some new presentations, book presentations. One on Italian immigrant radical culture, and the other a war against Puerto Ricans, called War Against All Puerto Ricans, right, which is an actual quote of a governor. So thank you very much. Okay, well, people should go to our online site and check the social media. So thanks.
Vito Marcantonio.
Yeah, Viva Vito Marcantonio.
For